When desperate widow Sarah Whitmore wraps her baby daughter and closes her eyes to freeze in the 1885 Buffalo blizzard, a mysterious stranger appears from the storm to save them both, offering shelter, warmth, and unexpected kindness in her darkest hour. But when railroad investigators arrive at his cabin the next morning, Sarah discovers her savior has been hiding a devastating secret about her husband's death that could have changed everything. Was Thomas Brennan her guardian angel, or the very man responsible for her suffering? The baby stopped crying, and that scared Sarah more than anything else that had happened in the past 3 months. Little Rose lay still in her arms, her tiny lips turning the color of winter sky. Sarah pressed her face against her daughter's forehead and felt skin as cold as the park bench beneath them. The snow kept falling on Buffalo's empty streets, covering everything in white silence. Sarah pulled the thin blanket tighter around Rose, but it was like trying to stop the wind with her bare hands. Her own fingers had gone numb an hour ago. She couldn't feel her feet anymore, and dark spots danced at the edges of her sight. This is how we die, she thought, quiet and forgotten like we never mattered at all. 3 months ago, she had been Mrs. William Whitmore, wife of a railroad engineer, living in a small but clean apartment above Murphy's Bakery. William would come home each evening smelling like coal smoke and metal, his face tired but smiling when he saw her and baby Rose. They had plans then: save money for a house, maybe have another child, grow old together watching their grandchildren play in a yard with real grass. Then came the accident. The train William was driving jumped the tracks outside the city. 15 people died, including William. The railroad company said it was his fault, claimed he had been drinking, that he made bad choices that killed innocent people. They paid Sarah nothing. Not $1 for her husband's death or for the baby who would never know her father. Drunk railroad men don't deserve anything, the company boss had told her, and neither do their families. Without William's pay, Sarah couldn't afford rent. Mrs. Murphy, who had seemed so kind before, suddenly needed the apartment for her own nephew. Other landlords took one look at Sarah, young woman, baby, no husband, no money, and shut their doors fast. She tried to find work, but nobody wanted to hire a woman with a baby. The church ladies whispered that she must have done something wrong to end up in such trouble. Even her own sister in Albany wrote back saying she couldn't help that kind of woman, as if being poor was catching like a disease. Sarah had sold everything: her wedding ring, William's pocket watch, even the tiny silver spoon that had been Rose's christening gift. The money lasted 2 weeks. Then came the cold weather, and suddenly staying warm became more important than staying fed. For the past month, they had been sleeping in doorways and under bridges. Rose cried constantly from hunger and cold. Sarah's milk was drying up because she ate so little. Every day, more doors slammed in their faces. Every night, the cold got deeper into their bones. This morning, Sarah had knocked on the last door she could think of, the boarding house on Elm Street where her friend Mary used to live. The owner, a woman with gray hair and hard eyes, looked at Sarah and Rose like they were something dirty. "We don't take in fallen women and their bastard children," the woman said. "Find somewhere else to spread your shame." The door slammed so hard that Rose started crying again. That was when Sarah walked to Delaware Park. That was when she sat on this bench and decided they couldn't keep fighting a world that didn't want them. She looked down at Rose again. Her daughter's breathing was so shallow now that Sarah had to watch closely to see her tiny chest move up and down. Rose's eyes were closed, her long lashes dark against pale skin that looked almost see-through. "I'm sorry, baby girl," Sarah whispered. Her words made little clouds in the freezing air. "Mama tried everything. I tried so hard." The wind picked up, throwing snow into her face like tiny needles. Sarah closed her eyes and pulled Rose as close as possible. Maybe if they fell asleep here, they would just drift away together. Maybe that would be kinder than watching Rose suffer anymore. But even as she thought this, something deep inside her rebelled. This was her daughter, her and William's daughter. Rose deserved better than dying on a park bench because the world was cruel and unfair. Sarah forced her eyes open and looked around the park. Street lamps glowed yellow through the falling snow, but they seemed impossibly far away. Her legs felt like wood, stiff and unfeeling. Even if she wanted to get up and keep walking, she wasn't sure she could. The wind died down for a moment, and in the quiet, Sarah heard something that made her heart skip. Footsteps, heavy boots crunching through snow, getting closer. Fear shot through her tired body. What if it was the police, coming to arrest her for sleeping in the park? What if it was someone dangerous, someone who would hurt them? In her condition, she couldn't run or fight. She couldn't even call for help. The footsteps stopped somewhere behind her bench. Sarah held her breath and squeezed Rose tighter. Maybe if she stayed very still, whoever it was would go away. "Ma'am." The voice was deep and rough, but there was something gentle in it that surprised her. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't turn around. "Ma'am, you can't stay out here tonight." Now she had to look. Slowly, Sarah turned her head and saw a tall man standing a few feet away. He was big, broad shoulders under a thick coat, work boots that had seen many winters. His face was mostly hidden by a heavy beard and a wool cap pulled low, but she could see kind eyes watching her with what looked like concern. Most men who approached women alone at night wanted something bad. But this one kept his distance and spoke softly, like he was trying not to scare her. "I know," Sarah managed to say. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. The man stepped closer, and she could see him better now. His coat was old but clean. His gloves had holes, but his hands looked strong and honest. He was maybe 30 years old, with brown eyes that reminded her of coffee on cold mornings. "You got somewhere to go?" he asked. Sarah shook her head. She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. The man knelt down in the snow beside her bench, bringing his face level with hers. Up close, she could see small scars on his hands, the kind that came from years of hard work, not from fighting. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Whitmore." "I'm Thomas," he said. "Thomas Brennan. And I think you and your baby need help." Thomas Brennan moved like a man who had rescued people before. Quick but careful, strong but gentle. "Can you walk?" he asked Sarah, already shrugging off his heavy coat. Sarah tried to stand, but her legs shook like tree branches in a storm. She had been sitting in the cold so long that her body forgot how to work right. Thomas caught her elbow before she could fall. "Easy now," he said, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. The coat still held warmth from his body, and Sarah almost cried at how good it felt. "We don't have far to go." "I can't pay you," Sarah said quickly. She had learned that people always wanted something, and she had nothing left to give. Thomas looked surprised. "Did I ask for money?" "No, but—" "Then don't worry about it." He looked down at Rose, who lay still and quiet in Sarah's arms. "How old is she?" "4 months," Sarah said. "Her name is Rose." "Pretty name for a pretty girl." Thomas touched Rose's tiny hand with one finger. "She's cold, but babies are tougher than they look. She'll be fine once we get her warm." Thomas helped Sarah walk across the park toward a small cabin that sat among the trees. Yellow light glowed in its windows, and smoke curled up from a stone chimney. It looked like something from a fairy tale, the kind of place where good things happened to people who had given up hope. "You live here?" Sarah asked. "Built it myself after the war," Thomas said. "Needed a place that was really mine, you know?" Sarah didn't know. She had never owned anything that was really hers, not even her own life. But the idea sounded wonderful, having a place where you belonged, where nobody could tell you to leave. Inside, the cabin was small but felt huge compared to the cold park bench. A stone fireplace filled one wall, its flames dancing and crackling. Simple wooden furniture sat around the room. A table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner. Shelves lined the walls, filled with more books than Sarah had seen outside of the town library. The warmth hit her like a wave, and suddenly Sarah could feel her hands and feet again. The feeling hurt, pins and needles shooting through her fingers and toes. But it was good hurt, the kind that meant her body was coming back to life. "Sit here," Thomas said, guiding her to a chair near the fire. He took Rose gently, his big hands surprisingly soft as he examined the baby. "She's breathing fine, just needs to warm up slow and steady." Thomas moved around the cabin like he was dancing, stirring something on the wood stove, pulling quilts from a wooden chest, adding logs to the fire. Everything he did seemed to have a purpose, like he had done this before. "You have children?" Sarah asked, watching how naturally he held Rose. Something sad passed across Thomas's face. There and gone so quick she almost missed it. "Had a son once," he said quietly. "Long time ago." He didn't say more, and Sarah didn't ask. Everyone had sad stories. Some people just carried them better than others. Thomas handed her a cup of something warm that smelled like milk and honey. "Drink this," he said. "It'll help you warm up from the inside." Sarah wrapped her cold fingers around the cup and sipped carefully. The liquid was sweet and rich, and she felt it spread warmth through her empty stomach. She couldn't remember the last time she had tasted anything so good. "Why are you helping us?" she asked. Thomas sat down in the other chair, holding Rose against his chest where she could hear his heartbeat. The baby's color was already getting better, pink creeping back into her pale cheeks. "Why wouldn't I?" he said. "Most people don't want to get involved," Sarah said. "They think if you're in trouble, you must have done something wrong." "Maybe I'm not most people." Sarah studied his face, trying to understand what kind of man brought strangers home in a snowstorm. He looked honest, the kind of person who said what he meant and meant what he said. But she had been fooled before. "What do you do?" she asked. "For work, I mean." "Different things," Thomas said. "Construction mostly. Some railroad work when they need extra hands." The word railroad made Sarah's stomach clench. Ever since William's accident, anything connected to trains and tracks made her feel sick with anger and grief. "You know much about the railroad companies?" she asked, trying to keep her voice normal. Thomas looked up from Rose, something careful in his expression. "Some." "Why?" "My husband worked for them. There was an accident." Sarah found herself telling Thomas about William, about the accident that killed him and 15 other people. She told him about the company saying William was drunk, about how they refused to pay her anything, about the long slide from respectability to desperation. Thomas listened without interrupting, his face growing darker as she talked. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "That's hard," he said finally. "Losing someone you love, then having people say bad things about them when they can't defend themselves. The company acts like William chose to kill all those people," Sarah said, and she could hear the bitterness in her own voice. "Like he woke up that morning and decided to destroy a train full of families. Companies like that, they always need someone to blame," Thomas said. "Easier than admitting their equipment might be bad or their safety rules might not work." Sarah looked at him sharply. He sounded like he knew more about railroad companies than he was letting on. But before she could ask, Rose started making small hungry noises. "She needs to eat," Sarah said, feeling suddenly shy. She had been nursing Rose wherever she could find shelter, in doorways, under bridges, behind buildings. But this was different. This was someone's home, and Thomas was being so kind. "I'll step outside for a minute," Thomas said, understanding immediately. "Check on the storm." After he left, Sarah settled Rose at her breast and looked around the cabin. Everything was clean and well cared for, but simple. No fancy decorations or expensive furniture. Just the basics that a man needed to live: table, chairs, bed, books, fireplace. The books surprised her most. She could see titles on philosophy, history, poetry. William had been a smart man, but he never had time to read much except newspapers and railroad schedules. This Thomas Brennan was more educated than he let on. Rose nursed hungrily, making small satisfied sounds. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt her daughter relax completely. The baby's breathing was deep, and even now, her skin warm and pink. When Thomas came back inside, brushing snow off his shoulders, he smiled at the sight of them. "Storm's getting worse," he said. "You'll need to stay the night." "I don't want to impose," Sarah began, but Thomas held up his hand. "No imposition," he said firmly. "Nobody should be out in weather like this, especially not with a baby." He pulled extra blankets from the chest and made a comfortable nest of quilts near the fire. "You can sleep here where it's warmest," he said. "I'll take the chair." "I can't take your bed," Sarah protested. "You're not taking it. I'm giving it." Thomas's voice was gentle but final. "Get some rest, Sarah Whitmore. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." As Sarah settled Rose into the warm nest of blankets, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: safety. Not just from the cold and snow, but from the world's cruelty. For one night, at least, she and Rose were protected. But as she drifted towards sleep, listening to the storm rage outside and the fire crackle inside, one question echoed in her mind. What kind of man was Thomas Brennan, really? And why did talking about the railroad make him look so troubled? Outside, the wind howled like something wild and dangerous. Inside, three strangers who had found each other in the storm settled into an uneasy peace, each carrying secrets that could change everything. The cabin door creaked open, and Sarah stepped into a world that felt like stepping inside a warm hug. Orange flames danced in a stone fireplace that took up half the wall. The sweet smell of burning wood mixed with something else, coffee, maybe, and the clean scent of soap. Sarah had forgotten what a truly warm room felt like. Her frozen fingers began to tingle as the heat reached them. "Sit right there," Thomas said, pointing to a wooden chair near the fire. "Don't move until I tell you." Sarah obeyed, too tired to argue. Rose stirred in her arms, making tiny sounds like a kitten. The baby's lips were still blue, but her breathing seemed easier now that they were out of the wind. Thomas moved around the small space like he'd done this 100 times before. He pulled thick blankets from a wooden chest that sat under the window. He filled a pot with water and set it on top of a black stove. He opened cabinets and drawers, gathering things Sarah couldn't see. The cabin was smaller than her old house, but it felt bigger somehow. Maybe because everything in it seemed to have a purpose. A bed sat in one corner, covered with a quilt that looked handmade. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books and jars and tools. A small table sat near the window with 2 chairs tucked underneath. "How long have you lived here?" Sarah asked. 3 years, Thomas replied, not looking up from whatever he was doing at the stove. "Built it myself after I came back from the war." Sarah studied his broad shoulders, the way his hands moved with confidence. She could picture him swinging a hammer, cutting wood, laying stones for the fireplace. It must have taken months to build this place. "Were you hurt in the war?" she asked. Thomas paused for just a second. "Not the way you mean." Before Sarah could ask what he meant by that, he turned around with a cup in his hands. Steam rose from the top of it. "Warm milk," he said, offering it to her. "Drink it slow." The first sip burned her tongue, but Sarah didn't care. The warmth spread down her throat and into her chest. She felt her whole body start to relax for the first time in days. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas knelt down next to her chair. "Let me see the baby." Sarah hesitated. Rose was the only thing she had left in the world. What if this man tried to take her away? What if he decided Sarah wasn't fit to be a mother? But Rose was still too cold, and Sarah didn't know how to warm a baby properly. She had to trust someone. Thomas took Rose with the same careful hands he'd used to make the milk. He unwrapped the thin blanket Sarah had covered her with and frowned. "She needs dry clothes," he said, "and a better blanket." He carried Rose to the bed and laid her down gently. From the wooden chest, he pulled out a soft white cloth and a thick wool blanket that looked like it had never been used. "Why do you have baby things?" Sarah asked. Thomas's hands stopped moving. His face grew dark, like a shadow had passed over it. "I had a son once," he said quietly. He died when he was about Rose's age. Sarah felt her heart squeeze. I'm sorry. His name was Daniel, Thomas continued, carefully wrapping Rose in the new blanket. He and his mother died of fever while I was away fighting. When I came home, the house was empty. The neighbors had buried them both. He picked up Rose again, and Sarah saw something in his eyes she recognized. The same deep sadness she carried inside herself. Is that why you helped us? She asked. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Maybe. Or maybe I helped you because it was the right thing to do. He handed Rose back to Sarah. The baby felt warmer now, and her color was better. She opened her eyes and looked around the room with the curious expression babies get when they find themselves somewhere new. She's beautiful, Thomas said. What's her father's name? William, Sarah replied. He died 3 months ago. I'm sorry for your loss. The words were simple, but Thomas said them like he meant them. Not like the people at the funeral who'd whispered about how Sarah would manage on her own. Not like the landlord who'd put them out on the street. Just sorry, like one person talking to another. He was a good man, Sarah said. He worked for the railroad. There was an accident. She stopped talking because the words always got stuck in her throat when she tried to explain what had happened. The train derailment. The company saying it was William's fault. The refusal to pay any compensation. You don't have to talk about it, Thomas said gently, but Sarah found she wanted to talk about it. Maybe because this man had lost someone too. Maybe because the warm cabin and the soft firelight made her feel safe for the first time in months. They said he was drinking, she continued. The railroad company. They said the accident was his fault, so they wouldn't pay me anything. But William never drank. Not ever. He promised me when we got married that he wouldn't touch alcohol. Thomas was very still, listening. I tried to tell them they were wrong, but they wouldn't listen to me. They said I was just a wife trying to protect her husband's reputation. They said I should be grateful they didn't sue me for the damage to their train. Sarah felt tears starting to come, but she kept talking. I had to sell everything we owned just to pay for his funeral. Then the landlord said I couldn't afford the rent anymore. I looked for work, but nobody wants to hire a woman with a baby. Especially not a woman they think is lying about her dead husband. Rose made a small sound, and Sarah looked down at her daughter's face. The baby was watching her with those serious blue eyes, as if she understood every word. So I walked, Sarah finished. I walked all over this city, knocking on doors, begging for work or charity or just a warm place to sleep, and every door closed in my face. Thomas was quiet for a while. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin, rattling the windows. But inside, the fire crackled peacefully, and Sarah felt safer than she had in months. You're not walking anymore, Thomas said finally. What do you mean? I mean you can stay here, as long as you need to. Help me keep the place clean, maybe cook sometimes. I'm not much good at cooking. Sarah stared at him. You don't even know me. I know you're a mother trying to take care of her child. I know you're honest and brave and you've been dealt a bad hand through no fault of your own. That's enough. Why would you do that for a stranger? Thomas looked into the fire, and Sarah saw that shadow cross his face again. Because everybody deserves a second chance, he said. And because this cabin gets awful lonely sometimes. Before Sarah could respond, Rose began to cry. Not the weak cry of a cold, hungry baby, but the strong, demanding cry of a child who was warm and felt safe enough to ask for what she needed. Sarah smiled, and realized it was the first time she'd smiled in months. But even as she felt hope beginning to grow in her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas was hiding something. Something important. Something that might change everything if she knew what it was. Rose's crying woke Sarah from the deepest sleep she'd had since William died. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The room was too warm, too bright. The bed was too soft. Then she heard the sound of someone moving around in the kitchen area, and everything came back to her. Thomas's cabin. The storm. The stranger who'd saved them both. Good morning, Thomas called softly from across the room. "Coffee's ready." Sarah sat up slowly, her body aching in places she'd forgotten could ache. Sleeping on park benches and doorsteps for weeks had taught her to sleep light and wake up ready to run. But last night, she'd slept like a person who felt safe. Rose was fussing, making the hungry sounds Sarah knew so well. She began to nurse her daughter, grateful for the warmth of the cabin and the privacy Thomas had given her by keeping his back turned. "There's food when you're ready," Thomas said. "Nothing fancy, but it's hot." Sarah looked around the cabin in the morning light. It looked different now, smaller but somehow more real. She could see the careful way Thomas had built everything, the way each piece of furniture fit perfectly in its space. This wasn't just a place to sleep. This was a home. "I should leave," she said suddenly. Thomas turned around, a bowl of oatmeal in his hands. "Why?" The question was simple, but Sarah didn't have a simple answer. She should leave because she couldn't take charity from a stranger. She should leave because she had imposed enough already. She should leave because staying felt too much like giving up on solving her own problems. But mostly, she should leave because she was starting to feel something she couldn't afford to feel: hope. "I can't stay here forever," she said. "I'm not asking you to stay forever," Thomas replied. "I'm asking you to stay long enough to figure out what comes next." He set the bowl on the small table and pulled out a chair for her. The simple gesture reminded Sarah of William, who'd always held her chair at their tiny kitchen table. "What if there is no what comes next?" she asked. "There's always something next," Thomas said firmly. "The question is whether you're strong enough to wait for it." Sarah moved to the table, still holding Rose. Through the window, she could see that the storm had passed. The world outside was covered in fresh snow that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun. "Tell me about your husband," Thomas said as Sarah began to eat. It was an unexpected request, and Sarah felt her chest tighten. People didn't usually want to hear about William. They wanted to hurry past the sad parts and get to what they could do to help, which was usually nothing. "He was kind," she said slowly. "Kinder than anyone I'd ever met. He never raised his voice, never said a harsh word about anybody." Thomas nodded, encouraging her to continue. "He loved trains," Sarah went on, surprised by how good it felt to talk about her husband. "He used to say they were like giant metal dragons, carrying people to places they'd never dreamed of going. He was so proud to work for the railroad." "What kind of work did he do?" "He was a brakeman. He helped stop the trains when they came into the station. It was dangerous work, but William was careful. He never took chances." Thomas grew very still. "A brakeman?" "Yes, he'd been doing it for 5 years. Never had an accident, never had a complaint from his supervisors. That's why I knew they were lying when they said the wreck was his fault." Thomas put down his coffee cup with hands that Sarah noticed were shaking slightly. "What exactly did they say happened?" he asked. Sarah felt a familiar anger rise in her chest. "They said he was drinking on the job. They said he failed to set the brakes properly when the train was coming into the station, and that's why it derailed and crashed into the building." "But you don't believe that." "I know it's not true," Sarah said firmly. "William promised me when we got married that he'd never drink alcohol. His father was a drunk who beat William's mother, and William swore he'd never be like that. He kept that promise every day of our marriage." Thomas was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the snow. "Sometimes companies lie," he said finally. "Sometimes it's easier to blame a dead man than to admit their equipment failed." Something in his voice made Sarah look at him more carefully. There was tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You sound like you know something about railroad companies," she said. "I know something about lies," Thomas replied. "And I know something about blame." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, Rose began to fuss again. Sarah stood to walk her around the cabin, bouncing gently the way that always calmed her daughter down. As she moved around the small space, she noticed things she'd missed the night before. A newspaper folded on the shelf, dated 3 months ago, right around the time of William's accident. a railroad timetable tacked to the wall near the door, a set of work gloves that looked like the kind railroad men wore. "Thomas?" she said slowly. "Did you know my husband?" Thomas went very still. When he looked at her, Sarah saw something in his eyes that made her stomach drop: guilt, fear, and something else she couldn't name. "Why would you ask that?" he said. "The newspaper, the timetable, those gloves." Sarah's voice was getting higher, more urgent. "You know something about the railroad. You know something about what happened to William." Thomas stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I think I hear horses," he said, moving toward the window. Sarah followed him, Rose still in her arms. Through the glass, she could see two men on horseback approaching the cabin. They wore heavy coats and serious expressions, and something about the way they sat their horses told Sarah they were used to getting what they came for. "Who are they?" she asked. Thomas's face had gone pale. "Nobody you need to worry about." But even as he said it, Sarah could see he was lying. His hands were clenched into fists, and there was sweat on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The men dismounted and approached the cabin with purpose. One of them knocked on the door, not a friendly knock, but the kind of knock that demanded an answer. "Thomas Brennan," a voice called out. "We need to talk." Thomas looked at Sarah, and in his eyes she saw something that made her blood run cold. The look of a man who'd been caught. "Stay here," he said quietly. "Whatever happens, stay inside with Rose." But as Thomas moved toward the door, Sarah felt everything she'd thought she understood about her situation beginning to shift. The kind stranger who'd saved her from the storm was about to become something else entirely. And she had the terrible feeling that whatever was about to happen would change everything once again. The sound of horses stopped right outside the cabin door. Sarah's heart started beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. Through the frosty window, she saw two big men getting off their horses. Their faces looked mean and cold, like the winter wind itself. Thomas dropped his coffee cup, crashed on the floor, and broke into pieces. "Stay quiet," he whispered to Sarah. "Don't let them see you." But it was too late. One of the men was already looking through the window. His eyes got wide when he saw Sarah holding baby Rose. He smiled, but it wasn't a nice smile. It was the kind of smile a wolf makes when it sees a lost sheep. "Well, well, well," the man said as he pushed open the door without knocking. "Look what we found here, Thomas. The pretty widow and her little baby." Sarah pulled Rose closer to her chest. The baby started crying, like she could feel the danger in the room. Sarah's hands shook as she tried to calm her down. The second man came inside too. He was even bigger than the first one. His boots made loud sounds on the wooden floor. "Mrs. Sarah Whitmore," he said. "We've been looking all over Buffalo for you." "How do you know my name?" Sarah asked. Her voice came out small and scared. "Oh, we know lots of things about you," the first man said. He took off his hat and shook the snow from it. "We know your husband died in that train crash. We know you've been sleeping in the streets. We know you've got no money and no family to help you." Thomas stepped between the men and Sarah. "Leave her alone, Davidson. She hasn't done anything wrong." "Davidson." Sarah's eyes got big. She knew that name. Mr. Davidson was the man from the railroad company. The man who said her husband William was drunk when the train crashed. The man who said it was all William's fault. "That's right, honey," Davidson said. "I'm the one who told you the truth about your no-good husband. And now I'm here to make sure the truth stays the truth." Sarah felt sick to her stomach. This was the man who had made her life so hard. The man who said William caused the accident. The man who refused to give her any money to take care of Rose. "What do you want?" Thomas asked. His hands were closed into fists. "We want to talk about what you saw that day," the second man said. "The day William Whitmore died." Sarah looked back and forth between the men. What did Thomas see? Why were they asking him about William's accident? "I already told you," Thomas said. "I don't know anything about it." Davidson laughed. It was a mean laugh, Now, Thomas. Don't lie to us. We have people who saw you at the train yard that day. They saw you watching when the train went off the tracks. Sarah felt like the room was spinning. Thomas was there when William died? He saw the accident happen? Is that true? She asked Thomas. Her voice was very quiet. Thomas looked at the floor. He couldn't look at her face. Sarah, I can explain. Explain what? She stood up, still holding Rose. Explain why you never told me you saw my husband die. It's more than that, honey, Davidson said. He was enjoying this. Sarah could tell. Your friend Thomas here knows the real reason that train crashed. And it wasn't because your husband was drinking. The room got very quiet. Sarah could only hear Rose crying and the fire crackling in the fireplace. Her legs felt weak, like they might not hold her up. What do you mean? She whispered. The brakes broke, the second man said. The train company knew they were old and dangerous, but they didn't want to spend money to fix them. So when the accident happened, they blamed your husband instead. Sarah sat down hard in the chair. She felt like she couldn't breathe. That's not true. Mr. Davidson told me William was drinking. He said it was William's fault. I lied, Davidson said. He didn't even look sorry about it. It was easier to blame a dead man than to admit the company messed up. Thomas finally looked at Sarah. His eyes were full of tears. I saw the whole thing, Sarah. Your husband tried everything to stop that train. He wasn't drunk. He was a hero. He saved 20 people's lives by staying at his post and trying to stop the crash. Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her William was a hero, not a drunk who caused an accident. But why didn't you tell anyone? She asked Thomas. Why didn't you tell me? Thomas's face turned red. Because they paid me not to. The words hit Sarah like a slap. They paid you? The railroad company offered me money to keep quiet, Thomas said. A lot of money. More money than I'd ever seen. I needed it, Sarah. After the war, I couldn't find good work. I was about to lose this cabin. Sarah stared at him. So you took their money, and you let me think my husband was a drunk. You let me and Rose almost starve. I didn't know you were William's wife until last night, Thomas said quickly. When you told me your name, I realized who you were. That's when I knew I had to help you. Help me? Sarah's voice got louder. You could have helped me 3 months ago. You could have told the truth and saved us from all this pain. Rose was crying harder now. The baby could feel how upset her mother was. Sarah tried to rock her, but her hands were shaking too much. Davidson clapped his hands together. This is all very touching, he said. But we have business to talk about. Thomas, the railroad company is getting worried. Too many people are asking questions about the accident. We need to make sure your story doesn't change. What story? Sarah asked. The story that says your husband caused the crash, the second man explained. The story that keeps the railroad company from having to pay money to all the families who got hurt. Sarah looked around the room. At Thomas, who had lied to her. At Davidson, who had made her life miserable. At the second man, who stood there like a big wall of meanness. How much money? She asked. Everyone looked surprised. What? Davidson said. How much money did you pay Thomas to lie about my husband? Davidson smiled his wolf smile again. $500. More money than you'll see in your whole life, honey. $500. That was more money than William made in a whole year at the railroad. It was enough money to buy a house. Enough money to make sure Rose never went hungry. And Thomas had taken it while Sarah and Rose were sleeping in the cold. I want to make a deal, Sarah said. Thomas looked shocked. Sarah, what are you doing? I'm being smart, she said. Something I should have done a long time ago. Davidson leaned forward. I'm listening. I want $1,000, Sarah said. $1,000, and I'll make sure Thomas never tells anyone what he really saw. The room got quiet again. Davidson looked at the second man. They whispered to each other for a minute. That's a lot of money, Davidson said. It's worth it, Sarah replied. Think about how much money you'll lose if everyone finds out the truth. Think about all the lawsuits. All the families who will want money for their dead husbands and sons. Thomas grabbed her arm. Sarah, you can't do this. Your husband was a good man. He deserves to have people know the truth. Sarah looked at him with cold eyes. My husband is dead, Thomas. Dead men don't need honor. But living babies need food. She bounced Rose gently. The baby had stopped crying and was looking around the room with her big blue eyes. William would want me to take care of our daughter, Sarah continued. He would want me to be smart and do whatever it takes to keep Rose safe. Davidson was nodding. I like this woman. She understands how the world really works. I understand that I've been a fool, Sarah said. I believed that good things happen to good people. I believed that the truth matters. I believed that someone would help me because it was the right thing to do. She looked straight at Thomas. But I learned that people only care about themselves. So now I'm going to care about myself too. Thomas looked like she had hit him. This isn't you, Sarah. This isn't who you really are. You don't know who I really am, Sarah said. You only know the desperate woman who almost froze in the snow. Well, that woman is gone. The new Sarah Whitmore is going to make sure her daughter has everything she needs. Davidson pulled out a big roll of money from his coat. I can give you $200 right now. The rest will come later. Sarah held out her hand. Deal. But as Davidson started counting the money, something strange happened. Rose reached out her tiny hand toward the bills. She grabbed one and crumpled it up in her little fist. Then she threw it on the floor. Everyone stared at the baby. Rose looked at her mother and made a sound. Not crying, but something else. Something that sounded almost like she was trying to talk. No, Rose seemed to say. No, no, no. Sarah felt something cold run down her back. It wasn't the winter cold from outside. It was something else. Something that made her remember who she really was. Rose's tiny fist held that crumpled dollar bill like it was poison. The baby looked right into her mother's eyes and made that sound again. No, no, no. Sarah felt like lightning had hit her. Her daughter, who could barely sit up by herself, had just told her not to take the dirty money. Rose couldn't even talk yet, but she knew right from wrong better than any of the grown-ups in that room. I changed my mind, Sarah said suddenly. Davidson stopped counting the money. What did you say? I said I changed my mind. Sarah stood up, still holding Rose. I don't want your money. But you just agreed to the deal, the second man said. He looked confused. Sarah walked over to where the dollar bill had fallen. She picked it up and threw it back at Davidson. Some deals aren't worth making. Thomas stared at her like he was seeing a ghost. Sarah, what are you doing? I'm remembering who I married, she said. William Whitmore was the most honest man in Buffalo. He never lied, never cheated, never took money he didn't earn. And I'm his wife. That has to mean something. Davidson's face got red and angry. You're making a big mistake, lady. We can make life very hard for people who don't cooperate. You already made my life hard, Sarah said. You made me think my husband was a drunk and a failure. You let me and my baby almost die in the cold. You can't make my life any worse than it already was. She turned to Thomas. But you can make it better. Thomas looked confused. What do you mean? Tell the truth, Sarah said. Write down everything you saw that day. Sign your name to it. Let everyone know that William Whitmore died a hero. If I do that, they'll make sure I never work again, Thomas said. They'll take away my cabin. I'll have nothing. Sarah looked around the little cabin. At the warm fire, the soft chairs, the books on the shelves. It was a nice place, a safe place, but it was built on lies and blood money. Then you'll know how it feels, she said quietly. You'll know what it's like to lose everything because of other people's lies. Thomas sat down hard in a chair. He put his head in his hands. Sarah, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was scared and selfish and stupid. Sorry doesn't feed my baby, Sarah said. Sorry doesn't give me back the 3 months I spent thinking my husband was a disgrace. But the truth might help other families who are going through what I went through. Davidson stepped closer to Sarah. He was a big man and he was trying to scare her. Listen here, little lady. You don't understand how powerful the railroad company is. We can destroy you. Sarah looked up at him. She was tired of being scared. Tired of being pushed around. Tired of letting other people decide what was going to happen to her and Rose. No, she said. You can't. What did you say? I said you can't destroy me. You already tried. You took away my money, my home, my husband's good name. You made me so desperate I was ready to die in the snow. But I'm still here. My baby is still here. And we're not going anywhere. Rose made a happy sound and clapped her little hands. She liked hearing her mother talk strong. The second man whispered something to Davidson. Davidson nodded and whispered back. They were making plans, and Sarah didn't like the look in their eyes. What if we told everyone in town that you're a bad woman? Davidson said. What if we said you were stealing and lying? What if we made sure no one would rent you a room or give you a job? Sarah felt scared for a second. She had Rose to think about. She couldn't let her baby suffer because of her choices. But then she looked at Thomas. He was watching her with sad eyes. He was waiting to see what she would do. Waiting to see if she would be brave or if she would give up. Then I guess I'll have to prove you wrong, Sarah said. She walked over to the small table where Thomas kept his paper and pens. She found a clean sheet and set it down in front of him. Write, she said. Sarah, write down what you saw the day my husband died. Write down how much money they paid you to keep quiet. Write down everything. Thomas picked up the pen. His hand was shaking. If I do this, there's no going back. There's already no going back, Sarah said. The only question is whether we're going to keep living with lies or start living with the truth. Davidson tried to grab the paper away. I won't let you do this. But Thomas was bigger and stronger. He held onto the paper and started writing. His pen moved fast across the page. I, Thomas Brennan, saw the train accident that killed William Whitmore, he wrote. The accident was not caused by drinking or carelessness. The brakes on the train were broken. Mr. Whitmore tried to stop the train and save the passengers. He died a hero. Davidson was so angry his face turned purple. You're going to be sorry you did this, Brennan. Both of you are going to be very sorry. Maybe, Sarah said. But at least we'll be sorry for doing the right thing instead of sorry for doing the wrong thing. Thomas kept writing. He wrote about the money the railroad paid him. He wrote about how they threatened him if he ever told the truth. He wrote about seeing Sarah and Rose in the snow and not knowing who they were at first. When he was done, he signed his name at the bottom. Then he looked at Sarah. What now? He asked. Sarah thought for a minute. She had to be smart about this. Davidson and his friend weren't going to give up easy. They would try to stop her from telling people the truth. Now we make copies, she said. Lots of copies. We give them to the newspaper, to the church, to anyone who will listen. The newspaper won't print this, Davidson said. We pay them good money to stay quiet about railroad business. Sarah smiled. It was the first real smile she'd had in months. Maybe the Buffalo newspaper won't print it. But there are other newspapers. Newspapers in other cities. Newspapers that don't take railroad money. She had an idea. A good idea. Thomas, you said you fought in the war, right? Yes. Why? Do you know other soldiers? Men who came back from the war and are having trouble finding work. Thomas nodded. Lots of them. Men who might be angry to find out that the railroad is lying about accidents and not paying families what they owe. Thomas's eyes got bright. He was starting to understand her plan. Very angry men. Davidson and his friend looked worried for the first time. They were used to dealing with scared women and desperate men. They weren't used to dealing with someone who was making plans. You can't fight the railroad company, the second man said. They have too much money and too much power. Maybe, Sarah said, but they have to live in this town. They have to look their neighbors in the eye. They have to sleep at night knowing what they've done. She picked up the paper with Thomas's confession. And now everyone is going to know what they've done. Rose started making happy baby sounds again. She was playing with the buttons on Sarah's dress, not knowing that her mother was fighting the biggest fight of her life. "I'm going to make you both pay for this," Davidson said. His voice was low and mean. "You already made us pay," Sarah said. "But we're still here, and we're going to make sure no other family has to go through what we went through." Thomas stood up. "Sarah's right. I should have done this months ago. I should have been brave enough to tell the truth from the beginning." "It's not too late to be brave now," Sarah said. Davidson and his friend headed for the door. "This isn't over," Davidson called back. "Yes, it is," Sarah said. "It's been over since the moment you decided to lie about my husband. You just didn't know it yet." After the men left, the cabin got very quiet. Thomas and Sarah looked at each other. They both knew their lives had just changed forever. "What happens now?" Thomas asked. Sarah looked down at Rose, who had fallen asleep in her arms. The baby's face was peaceful and happy. She trusted her mother to take care of her and do the right thing. "Now we tell the truth," Sarah said. "And we see what happens when good people decide to fight back." Outside, the wind was blowing hard. But inside the cabin, Sarah Whitmore felt warm and strong for the first time since her husband died. She had found her voice, and she was never going to be quiet again. 3 loud bangs on Sarah's door made her jump so hard that Rose started crying in her arms. Through the frosted window, she could see dark shapes moving outside in the early morning light, but she couldn't tell who they were or what they wanted. "Open up," a man's voice shouted. "We know you're in there." Sarah's heart started beating fast. It had been 2 days since Davidson and his friend left Thomas's cabin with the signed paper that proved her husband wasn't to blame for the train crash. 2 days since she'd felt strong and sure of herself for the first time in months. Now fear crept back into her chest like cold water. She wrapped Rose tighter in her blanket and moved away from the window. The baby kept crying, as if she could feel her mother's worry. "Mrs. Whitmore," another voice called out. "We just want to talk." Sarah recognized that voice. It was Mr. Peterson, who owned the general store in town. But why would he be here with other men, banging on her door like she was some kind of criminal? She took a deep breath and walked to the door, but didn't open it. "What do you want?" "We heard what happened with the railroad company," Peterson said. His voice sounded different than usual, angry and cold. "We heard you made them pay you money and sign papers." "That's right," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "They owed me that money. My husband died trying to save people." "That's not what we heard," another man said. Sarah didn't know this voice. "We heard you and that Thomas fellow made up lies to steal money from the railroad." Sarah felt her face get hot with anger. After everything she'd been through, after finally proving the truth, people were still trying to make her look bad. "We don't want your kind in this town," Peterson continued. "Women who lie and cheat and cause trouble for honest businesses." "I didn't lie about anything," Sarah called back. But even as she said it, she wondered if anyone would believe her. The railroad company had money and power. She was just a widow with a baby. She heard the men talking quietly outside, but couldn't make out their words. Then footsteps walked around the side of the house. They were checking all the windows, like they were planning something. Rose had stopped crying and was looking up at her mother with those big blue eyes. Sarah felt a fierce need to protect her daughter, stronger than any fear. "You have 5 minutes to pack your things and leave town," Peterson shouted. "If you're still here after that, we can't promise what might happen." Sarah's hands shook as she looked around the small cabin. Everything she and Rose owned could fit in one bag. But where would they go? How would they live? Then she remembered the money. The railroad company hadn't paid her yet, but they'd promised it would come within a week. If she left now, she might never get it. And more than that, if she ran away, it would look like she really had done something wrong. She thought about her husband William, and how brave he'd been when the train started to crash. He hadn't run away. He'd stayed and tried to save everyone, even though it cost him his life. "No," she said quietly to herself, then louder, so the men outside could hear. "No, I'm not leaving." The talking outside stopped. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in the silence. "What did you say?" Peterson asked. "I said no. This is my home now and I'm not leaving. I haven't done anything wrong, and I won't be scared away by bullies." "You think you're better than us?" the unknown voice yelled. "You think because you got some money from the railroad, you can look down on honest folks?" "I don't think I'm better than anyone," Sarah replied. "But I know I'm not worse than anyone either. My husband was a good man and I'm a good mother. That's all that matters." She heard footsteps coming closer to the door, and her heart started racing again. But then another voice spoke up, a woman's voice. "That's enough, Peterson." Sarah pressed her ear to the door. She knew that voice too. It was Mrs. Murphy, who ran the boarding house on Elm Street. "This isn't your business, Catherine," Peterson said. "It becomes my business when men start threatening women and babies," Mrs. Murphy replied firmly. "Now you all get away from this house before I call the sheriff." "The sheriff knows what's going on," Peterson said. "He agrees with us." "Does he now?" Mrs. Murphy sounded surprised, but not scared. "Well then, I guess we'll see what the judge thinks about men terrorizing widows. I'm sure the newspaper would be interested in that story too." Sarah heard more talking, but couldn't make out the words. The voices were moving away from the door. After a few minutes, she heard horses riding away. A gentle knock came at the door. "Mrs. Whitmore? It's Catherine Murphy." "They're gone now." Sarah opened the door slowly. Mrs. Murphy stood on the porch, her gray hair pinned up neatly and her coat buttoned tight against the cold. She was a small woman, but her eyes were sharp and kind. "Thank you," Sarah said. "I don't know what they might have done if you hadn't come." "Nonsense," Mrs. Murphy said, stepping inside without being asked. "I've known Henry Peterson since he was a boy pulling girls' braids in school. He's all noise and no action." She looked around the cabin, then at Rose. "Though I will say you've stirred up quite a fuss in town." "I just wanted the truth to come out about my husband," Sarah said. "And it has, hasn't it?" Thomas Brennan finally told everyone what he saw that day, about how the train's brakes failed, and how your William died trying to stop it. Mrs. Murphy sat down in the chair by the fire. Course, that made some people angry. The railroad company has been telling everyone it was William's fault for months. Now they have to admit they were wrong. "So people are mad at me for proving my husband wasn't a drunk?" "Some people don't like being wrong," Mrs. Murphy said with a shrug. "And some people don't like it when someone they see as beneath them stands up for themselves." Sarah felt tears starting to form in her eyes. "Maybe I should leave. Maybe it would be easier." "Easier for who?" Mrs. Murphy asked sharply. "For Henry Peterson? For the railroad company? What about easier for you and that baby?" Sarah looked down at Rose, who was trying to grab her mother's finger with her tiny hand. "Let me tell you something, dear," Mrs. Murphy continued. "I've been in this town for 40 years. I've seen men try to push women around before. If you run now, you'll spend the rest of your life running. But if you stay and fight, you might just win." "Fight how? I don't have any power. I'm nobody important." Mrs. Murphy laughed, but it wasn't a mean laugh. "You just made the railroad company admit they were wrong and pay you money they didn't want to pay. You call that having no power?" Sarah had never thought of it that way before. "Besides," Mrs. Murphy added, "you're not fighting alone. There are other women in this town who've been pushed around by their husbands' bosses. Other widows who've been cheated out of what they're owed. They're watching what you do, Sarah Whitmore. If you show them it's possible to stand up and win, they might find the courage to do the same." As if to prove her point, another knock came at the door. This time it was softer, more hesitant. Sarah opened it to find a young woman about her own age, holding a baby only slightly older than Rose. The woman's clothes were patched and worn, and her face was thin with worry. "Mrs. Whitmore? My name is Emma Collins. My husband died in the mine accident last month, and the company says it was his fault too. They won't pay me anything." She paused, looking nervously at Mrs. Murphy. "I heard what you did with the railroad. I was wondering, could you maybe help me figure out how to fight them too?" Sarah looked at Emma's hopeful face, then at her baby, then at Mrs. Murphy, who was smiling knowingly. "Come in," Sarah said, stepping aside. "Let's talk." As Emma entered the cabin, Sarah realized that Mrs. Murphy was right. She wasn't just fighting for herself and Rose anymore. She was fighting for every woman who'd been told she didn't matter, every widow who'd been cheated, every mother who'd been made to feel ashamed for circumstances beyond her control. The thought was scary, but it was also exciting. For the first time since William's death, Sarah felt like she had a purpose bigger than just surviving. "Now then," she said, settling Rose in her basket and turning to Emma. "Tell me everything that happened." "Sarah, you need to see this." Thomas stood in her doorway holding a newspaper, his face pale and worried. It had been 3 weeks since Emma Collins had first knocked on Sarah's door asking for help, and word had spread quickly through town. Every few days, another woman showed up: widows, wives of injured workers, mothers whose sons had been hurt in dangerous jobs. Sarah had turned her small cabin into an unofficial meeting place where women could share their stories and plan how to fight back against companies that treated workers like they didn't matter. "What is it?" Sarah asked, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd been preparing lunch for the 5 women who were coming that afternoon to talk about the textile factory's unsafe working conditions. Thomas held out the paper. The headline. Sarah read it aloud: "Local Widow Leads Rebellion Against Business Owners." Her stomach dropped as she scanned the article. It made her sound like a troublemaker who was trying to hurt the town's economy. It said she was teaching women to be ungrateful and demanding. "They're trying to make people afraid of you," Thomas said quietly. "They're trying to make people hate me," Sarah corrected. She sat down in her chair, suddenly feeling very tired. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I am causing too much trouble." Rose crawled over to her mother and pulled herself up using Sarah's skirt. At 8 months old, she was getting strong and curious about everything around her. She babbled happily, not understanding the grown-up worries filling the room. "You're not causing trouble," Thomas said firmly. "You're fixing problems that were already there. Tell that to the people who won't sell me food at the market anymore, or the landlord who says he might not let me renew my lease." Thomas sat down across from her. Over the past weeks, he'd been helping in small ways, fixing broken things in the cabin, carrying messages between the women when it wasn't safe for them to meet in person, even lending money when someone needed it desperately. "There's something else," he said hesitantly. "I heard Peterson and some other men talking at the tavern last night. They're planning something." Sarah looked up sharply. "What kind of something?" "They want to scare you into leaving town. Peterson thinks if you're gone, all the other women will give up and stop causing problems." "And what exactly does he plan to do?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know all the details, but they mentioned the sheriff, and something about finding a reason to arrest you." Sarah felt cold fear creep up her spine. If she was arrested, what would happen to Rose? Who would take care of her daughter while she sat in jail? But then she thought about Emma Collins, who'd gotten the mining company to pay her enough money to keep food on the table for her children. She thought about Martha Webb, whose husband had been hurt at the steel factory and was finally getting the medical care he needed because Martha had learned to demand it. She thought about all the women who'd found their voices because she'd shown them it was possible to speak up. "I can't stop now," she said, more to herself than to Thomas. "I'm not asking you to stop. I'm asking you to be careful." Before Sarah could respond, a commotion outside made them both look toward the window. A group of women was walking up the path to her cabin, but something was wrong. They were moving fast, looking over their shoulders like they were being followed. Emma Collins reached the door first, her face flushed with excitement and fear. "Sarah, something wonderful and terrible has happened." "What do you mean?" The governor, Emma said breathlessly. He's coming here, to our town. Someone wrote him a letter about what we're doing, and he wants to investigate the companies himself. Sarah's heart jumped. The governor was the most powerful person in the state. If he was coming to investigate, it meant their fight was being taken seriously at the highest levels. That's the wonderful part, said Martha Webb, pushing into the cabin behind Emma. The terrible part is that Peterson and his friends are furious. They're saying we've brought shame on the town, and that we need to be stopped before the governor arrives. When is he coming? Sarah asked. Tomorrow, Emma said, and he wants to meet with you personally. Sarah sank into her chair, overwhelmed. She'd started this whole thing just trying to get the money her husband had earned. Now she was going to meet with the governor of the entire state. I don't know what to say to someone that important, she admitted. You say the same thing you've been saying to all of us, Martha replied. You tell the truth. Thomas, who'd been listening quietly, spoke up. There's more you need to know. Peterson went to see Sheriff Williams this morning. I think they're planning to arrest you before the governor gets here. The women all started talking at once, their voices rising with worry and anger, but Sarah barely heard them. She was looking down at Rose, who'd fallen asleep in her arms, her tiny face peaceful and trusting. Everything had started with this baby. Sarah's desperate need to keep her daughter safe and fed had led her to that bench in the snow, ready to give up. But it had also led her to find strength she didn't know she had. Now other women were counting on her. The governor was coming because of her, and men with power were trying to stop her because they were afraid of what she represented. I need to see the governor, she said suddenly. But if they arrest you first, Emma started. Then you'll have to tell him what happened, Sarah interrupted. All of you. You'll have to tell him how they tried to silence us, and why. She stood up, gently placing Rose in her basket. Thomas, I need you to do something for me. Anything. If something happens to me, if I get arrested or worse, I need you to make sure Rose is taken care of. And I need you to make sure the other women don't give up the fight. Sarah, nothing's going to happen to you. You can't promise that. But you can promise me that this won't all be for nothing. Thomas nodded solemnly. I promise. Sarah looked around at the faces of the women who'd become her friends and allies. A few months ago, she'd been completely alone, with no one to turn to and nowhere to go. Now she was surrounded by people who cared about her and believed in what she was doing. Tomorrow, when the governor comes, we're going to tell him everything, she said. About the train accident, about the mine collapse, about the factory conditions, about all of it. We're going to show him that working people deserve to be treated fairly, and that women deserve to have their voices heard. What if Peterson tries to stop us? Emma asked. Sarah smiled, and for the first time in months, it was a smile with no fear in it at all. Then we'll deal with Peterson too. We've come too far to be scared by bullies now. As the women left to prepare for the governor's visit, Sarah sat alone with Rose and Thomas. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Are you really not afraid? Thomas asked. Sarah considered the question honestly. I'm terrified, she admitted. But I'm more afraid of what happens if we don't try to change things. I'm more afraid of Rose growing up in a world where people like us don't matter. She picked up her daughter, who yawned and stretched in her arms. Besides, she added, I've already survived the worst thing I could imagine. Everything else is just a challenge to overcome. That night, as Sarah lay in bed with Rose sleeping beside her, she thought about how much had changed since that terrible night in the snow. She'd gone from a woman with nothing to lose to a woman with everything to fight for. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, maybe even new dangers. But tonight, for the first time since William's death, Sarah Whitmore felt truly alive.